Thank you, Becky. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon and Shona Tova. So when I knew that I was going to be doing this, I told my wife, Bing, that I was going to be doing a forgiveness seminar locally, and I asked her if she'd like to come. And she said, knowing that it's about forgiveness, she said, not only will I come, but I insist on coming. So anyway, I'm glad you're here. And the other thing I'd like to tell you about my wife and I is that we actually make forgiveness pretty much a daily ritual at our home. Bing forgives me almost daily for my absolute steadfast refusal to get rid of what she refers to as a failed attempt to have a good-looking man's ponytail. And then I forgive her. Since we got married, she's, demanded to take over kitchen duties. I'm not allowed to make any meals in the kitchen, and all meals have to be homemade. And she actually is very adamant that I eat everything on my plate. And so I forgive her because I have an extra 10 to 12 pounds of weight that I really didn't want. And so I forgive her, for that almost on a daily basis. So we kind of go back and forth and forgive each other. So I've been conducting programs on the subject of forgiveness for about 6 years now. And I always begin each program by asking those in attendance, how many of those are there above and beyond just getting information out of curiosity on the subject of forgiveness? In other words, how many people are there because they themselves are willing to own a deeper truth, and that is that they're harboring some negative feelings about their past when it comes to forgiving, either themselves or others. And without exception, 9 out of 10 people in a room will raise their hands, yes, that's me, that's me. So then I ask each person to identify that particular wound which they have been holding on to the longest. And so what we do is we end up going around the room and people share with me and each other how long they've been holding on to those feelings, to those wounds. And I got to tell you that it's very common for me to hear people talking about holding on to the emotional past for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and longer. So what I have learned over these past 6 years is that a lot of people, a large percentage of the world's population, in every country, in every city, and in every town, wake up every day emotionally attached to the harm and the pain of the past. And that's preventing them from living with unobstructed joy and peace in their lives. They're only free in their movements, but they're fighting a battle within their heart that prevents them from being truly free. It has often been said that the biggest battles fought are not those on the battlefield. They are fought within ourselves. And when you don't forgive, you are living in the past with the weight of yesterday on your shoulders. And it prevents you from being 100% in the present. I know that feeling well because I too lived emotionally in the past for 46 years. I call it living in an emotional cage. And I will share more about that with you in a couple of minutes. The pain isn't always felt. but it's always present. And as long as it is present, we will continue to be prisoners of the past fighting a battle that each one of us deserves to be free from. Words that could be used to describe these feelings and our emotions include betrayal, abandonment, bitterness, resentment, anger, shame, remorse, regret, guilt. And many people fighting this battle will never make the decision to move beyond the past. Forgiving is not a feeling. Forgiving is a decision. And those of us who choose not to let go of the past will end up taking their anger and their bitterness and their resentment to their graves. It can be found buried in the soil of every graveyard in the world. The soil of the earth is drenched with these toxic feelings. And there's no more room in any graveyard for any more soil ground. There's way too much hate and anger alive and thriving in this world. And it must be stopped before we destroy ourselves. On a religious sense, certainly God has an everlasting tear in his eye because he gave us, every human being who ever lived and is alive today, the ability to leave the emotional cage of the past and to be emotionally free now and forever. But as the rabbi said a couple of weeks ago when I was listening with an open ear, God won't do for us what he gave us the ability to do for ourselves. We have to do it ourselves. On occasion, when I conduct one of these workshops, people will come up to me and they will tell me about an event in their lives that happened that crossed the line. And they have determined what happened to me is unforgivable. I've had religious leaders, business owners, retired doctors, and even mental health professionals tell me their stories of the harm that was done to them and why they just can't forgive. A retired psychologist, 87 years old, who taught psychology at a very prestigious university for over 30 years, confided in me that he still feels hate for his deceased father, stemming back from his early childhood days. A religious leader in his community came to my program and was waiting in line to tell me his story of being asked to resign from his church. He called it an act of treason. The anger could be seen in his eyes. The fury was boiling inside of him. Perhaps he was hoping that I would say he had a legitimate reason to not forgive. He was trying his best to justify why he should continue to live with anger and to keep living in his emotional cage. In every story that I've ever heard doing these workshops, the message is the same. They were letting the severity of what happened determine the outcome. Their outcome. Not the other person's outcome, but their outcome. So a question that I want to present to you to think about is there an act so heinous so cruel, so harmful, so life-changing, that we can justify crossing the line, drawing a line, and determining this is unforgivable. We don't have to look far to find the answer. When we ask God to forgive us for our sins, God doesn't pick and choose which sins are forgivable and which are not. God doesn't draw the line, and neither should we. If the severity of the harm done could justify not forgiving, Nelson Mandela would certainly be towards the front of the line. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in hard labor, 18 of those years in Robben Island. And every day he was breaking rocks in the gravel. He and his co-conspirators were separated from everyone else, were given little to eat, not allowed to interact with each other. And Mandela slept on a bare concrete floor with no pillow, no blanket, no bed. His bathroom was a bucket, which he could only empty when the bucket was full. Mandela was allowed one visitor a year for 30 minutes. No written correspondence in or out, no library, no resources. He was treated like a dog. 4 years after Mandela was released from prison, he became the president of South Africa. And Nelson Mandela invited on his list of guests all of the jailers that treated him so harshly, so cruel, were all invited to come to his inauguration. And they all came. And they asked Mr. Mandela, why? Why did you invite all these people that treated you so harshly, so cruel? They barely fed you, and they tortured you. Why did you invite them to your inauguration? And here's what he said. He said, because resentment is like drinking poison, thinking it's going to kill our enemies, but it only hurts us. I'm going to repeat that. Resentment is like drinking poison, thinking it's going to kill our enemies. Mahatma Gandhi, another example, one of the most influential leaders the world has ever known, for his peaceful resistance to oppression and injustice. Gandhi inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the whole world. But he paid a price for it. He was repeatedly arrested and sent to prison from 1908 to 1942. Always being arrested for not giving in, for standing up for what he believed. And Gandhi often was quoted as saying these words: "No one can emotionally hurt me without my permission." And the same thing applies to each one of you today. No one can harm you emotionally without your permission. It is a choice. Senator John McCain, who recently passed away, spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. 2 of those years were in solitary confinement. He was not given proper medical treatment. They treated him very harshly. He was repeatedly beaten and tortured. Shortly before John McCain passed away, if you looked on television, you couldn't help but see some of the excerpts of some of the things that John McCain said in interviews before his death. And one of the things that John McCain said is that he has no regrets. John McCain said, "I consider myself to be one of the most fortunate men who ever lived. And I'm one of the luckiest men alive." John McCain looked within to determine his feelings. And he let himself out of the emotional cage a long time ago. It's not what happens to us that determines if we carry the weight of yesterday on our shoulders. It's what we decide to feel in our hearts that will define if we live with peace and contentment in our lives or not. Last year, my wife and I were in Washington, D.C. at the Holocaust Museum, and this was my third time being there. Before I left, I noticed something different this time. There was a sign that pointed to a direction that said, "You can talk one-on-one to an actual Holocaust survivor who's in the building today." And it pointed a direction which I followed to two women who were seated, who were Holocaust victims. And I went over to one of them. I waited my turn, and then I sat down to talk to her. And she told me a little bit about her story. She was in Buchenwald, and she was liberated after 3 years there. But she said some of her family did not survive. And what she told me is, she said, to this day, I cannot look at a German in the eyes. I felt like crying. Although she was liberated over 60 years earlier, she could not liberate herself from the emotional pain of the past and experience what it's like to be emotionally free. And the truth is, no one was more deserving than her to live each day with joy and peace and contentment than she was. Although she was free in her movements and free in her environment and free to have complete happiness and peace in her life, here she was still battling the demons and the ghosts of 60 years ago. The words which echo in our minds when we think of the Holocaust is that we shall never forget, not that we shall never forgive. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of ordinary people living in this world that by listening to their stories, you would think they had every reason in the world not to forgive because of what happened to them. But they forgave anyway. Most of us remember this picture. Going back from the Vietnam War in the 70s, of a 9-year-old girl, Phan Kim Phu, who was severely burned, over 40% of her body, and severely disfigured. This picture was taken of her when she was 33 years old. And you can see how distorted her back was and her arms. And I read a little bit about her story. And she's had over 60 operations, skin transplants, and skin grafts. And she continues to live each day in excruciating pain. But through that, she became an advocate for peace and what it's like to live a life of joy and happiness, even someone like that with such a horrible past that's reminded every day physically. In 1996, Kim went to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., where she gave a speech. And after that speech, a man came up to her and introduced himself and said, "I'm the one who ordered the bombing. My name is John Plummer, and I want to ask for your forgiveness." Not only did she forgive him, but they ended up making several speeches together throughout the United States. And this is a picture of both of them. And you can tell that they're both smiling. This is the look of people who have forgiven. Ironically, or I should say sadly, it was later determined that he had fabricated his story. He had felt so much guilt that he felt compelled emotionally to say that to her. But the fact is that she didn't know that. All she knew when he met her that afternoon was that he was the one that ordered the bombing, and she made a decision to forgive him. That's the message. This is a picture of a father who lost his 22-year-old son, who was delivering pizza for Pizza Hut. And a man came up to him and stabbed him and killed him. The father was asked to come to court to give a victim statement that would affect this man's sentence. And the father stood up there and looked at the prisoner and said, "If my son were here, he would forgive you. And I need to forgive you." And he went up to him and gave him a Kleenex. And as the young man took the Kleenex, he took his arm and he brought him to embrace him. And they cried together. One more example. Detective Stephen Mcdonald. When he was 27 years old, as a detective, he was called to go to Central Park in New York and investigate some bicycle robberies. He saw 3 men who looked suspicious. When he approached the men and began a conversation, he looked down at one of the bicycles and was shot 3 times in the back and became a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. 6 months after he was shot, his daughter was born. And he said at that moment, he said, "You know what?" He said, "I need to be really thankful that God gave me the ability to be a father." Everyone in this room has the power that these people have. It is a gift from God to us to be able to repair ourselves emotionally. But God won't do for us what He gave us the ability to do for ourselves. When we allow the past to prevent us from being emotionally free, We give away our gift. We give away our power to heal. And we hand it over to those who harmed us instead, so that they can continue to hurt us. And then we become a victim. We feed into others' weaknesses instead of using our own strength to repair ourselves emotionally and move forward. Blaming others for their harmful actions is different than blaming others for our feelings. No one has control over our feelings. It's ours alone. And it's not what happened that determines our feelings. It's how we choose to respond that determines how we're going to feel. Now, I also want to say that we're not immune from pain. If somebody says something or does something to us that hurts us, we can't just snap our finger and say, there's not going to be any pain in what just happened. But the power of decision allows us to determine, is this feeling going to become more than just a reaction? Are we going to allow this pain to be temporary, or are we going to open the door and let that pain become a part of our psyche, our soul? Let it become attached to us like a cancer. We must remind ourselves that no one can harm us emotionally without our permission. It's a decision. Our feelings are a decision, and no one can make that decision regardless of what was said or done except for us. So I want to talk to you about some indisputable facts when it comes to forgiving. Number one, it is impossible to live in this world without being hurt, offended, misunderstood, manipulated, deceived, lied to, and rejected. Because the law of free will gives people the ability to do those things. It is impossible to live in this world without being the recipient of other people's cruelty, anger, indifference, neglect, and abandonment. And it is an absolute certainty that the world we live in will from time to time prevent us from receiving what we need and what we want. What we want from others, including family members and those who we're closest to. Forgiving is not an open door to go back into the fire. If the person who we need to forgive has not changed, and it is inevitable that by going into that, back to that relationship, we're going to continue to be hurt over and over and over again. We have to stop and think for a minute that forgiving doesn't mean getting hurt. Forgiving means self-love and self-care. And to achieve that, we need to create a boundary for ourselves to avoid being hurt again. Then that's what we do. I have a sister. I'll do a 2-minute confession here. I have a sister who I have not spoken to in 7 years. She lives in Dallas. She's a doctor, very successful. Her husband's a doctor. But I haven't spoken to my sister in 7 years by choice. because my sister made a decision when I was really young that she was going to put me on a different pedestal than she is used to in communication with her other family and friends. And her actions growing up my entire life have been, as a sister, one with indifference and apathy and not caring and not being there for me when I needed her. And so I made a decision to do two things. Number one, I made a decision to forgive my sister. I needed to do that for me. But I also made another decision for me, and that is that I needed to protect my feelings from being hurt again. And that's called self-love and self-care. So there is no law or there is no religion that requires us to forgive and to continue to be hurt over and over and over and over again. Forgiving is not forgetting. It is remembering what happened, but free from the pain of the past. Forgiving is not condoning the actions of others or in any way diminishing what happened. Here's another thing about forgiving. It doesn't require acceptance by anyone. When we forgive someone, they are free to reject our forgiveness. But the act of forgiveness is complete once you have forgiven. There's no going back. It requires no response. It requires no acknowledgement. And here's the math. It takes two to hurt, but just one to forgive. So when you forgive, expect nothing in return, because you're doing this for you, so that you can get what you need and what you deserve, and that is to be emotionally free. As Jews, it is written that we're supposed to forgive others by direct contact. It's written. It's a written law. If we forgive others by direct contact, the truth is it may open a new chapter in their lives. If they ask for forgiveness, give them what they need. It is an act of kindness. If they did not ask for forgiveness, give them what they need anyway, because you're doing it for yourself. Not forgiving results in two wrongs. And here's another mathematical equation. Two wrongs never equals a right. Two wrongs equals two wrongs. Forgiving should not be an attempt by us to correct someone who insists that they did nothing wrong. And here's a question. Think about this one. Is it better to be right, or is it better to be content with a free heart? Free to accept all of the joy that life can bring us. Forgiving has nothing to do with the validity of their actions. Forgiving is not letting them off the hook or giving them a free pass. Forgiving is giving us a free pass to move forward, past the harm and the pain. And I got to tell you something else. Forgiving others is only part of it. We also have to forgive ourselves for those things that we have said or done that we have regret and remorse over. I have a some spiritual judgment that I'm going to share with you about remorse and regret and shame. I know for me why God gave me the ability to feel shame and remorse and regret. It was never intended for any of us to own these feelings for the rest of our lives. God never intended that. God intended for us to own these feelings only long enough to learn from and move forward. We were created, those feelings, in order to survive the human race. Think about this. If we lived in a world not capable of us feeling remorse and guilt and shame, the truth is we would be a lawless society. We could run over someone and kill them, and then go to Mcdonald's and have a Big Mac with a big Diet Coke and never think twice. A world with no conscience for our actions could not survive. But feeling shame and regret and guilt and remorse over the harm that we have caused others, as I mentioned before, was never ever intended to be a lifelong wound in our hearts. I really believe that. But some of us never stop to look within and say, you know what? We have the ability and the power of decision to move forward. When we stop looking outside of ourselves to determine our feelings and we begin looking inside, we will find the answers we are looking for. Accept the possibility when it comes to forgiving others that those who have caused us harm and pain in our lives may be living in their own emotional cage, which is even larger than ours. They may be living a life of larger wounds from their own past than us. We just don't see it. People who live with joy in their lives and with peace and contentment, as a general rule of thumb, there's always exceptions, do not wish to intentionally harm others. People who intentionally harm others, even family members, are often dealing with their own pain by acting out, releasing their vengeance and their fury as a way of medicating themselves and lessening their own pain by giving it to others. And often it's the ones that they are the closest to who didn't deserve it. But it's only a temporary fix for them. It will never be a solution. What we perceive about others is not always reality. There's often a larger picture than what we see. There's a story, a true story, about a man who gets on a train, a subway train. He's going to work. And the train is packed. There's only room on the train for one person to sit down. The whole train is packed. So this man gets on the train and he takes the only seat that he can take. There's only one option, one seat. So he sits down and he happens to be sitting next to a man right across from him, a young father with 2 kids. And as time goes by, the man who just got on the train notices that the young father is sitting down, looking at the ground and unaware and oblivious to the fact that his kids were out of control. They were being unruly, and they were being rude, and they were jumping up and down and screaming and hollering and just having child's play, but they were interrupting everybody else on the train. They were annoying everybody else on the train, especially this man. And as time went by, he couldn't believe that this young father didn't seem to care about his children's unruly behavior. And he became more and more upset. And this man noticed through time that his blood pressure started to go higher and higher and higher. He was really getting upset about this. He was thinking to himself, why can't this father control his kids? And the kids are running up and down, and he's looking and he notices that the kids are annoying everybody, not just him. So what he was perceiving was a young father who didn't care about his kids. And as time went by, he finally said, you know what, I can't help it. I need to confront this man. I need to ask this man, why is he oblivious to what's going on with his children? Why? So he confronts the man sitting across from him. He says, sir, he says, excuse me, he says, for 20 minutes I've been on this train and your kids are being obnoxious. They're out of control and you don't seem to care. Why? Why do you not care about your kids? He was angry. And the man, the young father, looked up at him and he started crying. He could see the tears coming down his face. And the young father looked at the man and said, I am so sorry. He said, I just didn't even realize it. He said, you know, we just left the hospital. And my wife just died. And I am grieving. I don't know what's going to happen because my children no longer have a mother. And I am just grieving, and I am so sorry. And the man who confronted him responded and said, no, sir, no. I owe you an apology. I am the one who's so sorry. Can I hug you? And they stood up and they hugged each other and they cried and they cried. And when I heard that story, I said, you know what? It's true. It's true. What we perceive about other people, especially those who have harmed us, there's usually a bigger picture. When my father was alive, I perceived my father as a happy man in a marriage with a woman who he deeply loved, my stepmother. My father did what he loved doing. He was a mental health therapist at an inpatient psychiatric hospital in Colorado Springs. And he loved his work. He loved helping others. My father and I had a difficult relationship for 46 years. And for 46 years, I lived in my own emotional cage. I never forgave my father for the hurt that I endured as a child. For 46 years, I could have forgiven my father, but I chose not to. And then one day, on a Saturday morning, I got a call from my stepmother informing me that my father had taken his own life that morning, and he was gone. I had 46 years to make it right. And now there was no more time to say what I needed to say, that I forgave him. I learned some things that day. I learned some life lessons that day that I want to share with you. One of the lessons that I learned that day is that there is no certainty that what can be done today can be done tomorrow. Because tomorrow is a mystery not only to God. Time waits for no one. The other lesson that I learned is that when we judge someone and we base our feelings around that judgment, we don't always know all the facts. People who hurt us don't always share their deep pain. They don't always ask for help. I never knew that my father suffered from depression for the past 15 years of his life and was seeing a psychiatrist and was sinking deeper and deeper into a darkness that he could no longer fight. I never knew my father had medical problems, including COPD, that made him struggle to breathe at night. I never knew my father had been diagnosed with stage 1 of Alzheimer's a month before he took his life. My father chose not to share his pain and his battle with me. Had he done so, perhaps I would have forgiven him a long time ago, seeing him in so much pain. I tell my story every time I do a program, not to gain sympathy or pity, but as a reminder to all of us that there is often a bigger picture than what we see. And we should never wait for tomorrow to do what we can do today. Some of you in this room, like me, may have some unspoken words that you needed to say to someone in your life who is no longer here. I have a message for you. The message came to me 2 weeks after my father's death, and it's time for me to share with you this message. The message came to me in a synagogue in Prescott. I was sitting in a sanctuary trying to grasp the reality of my father's death. I was deep in grief, not knowing how I would make it through the day. And I opened a prayer book. I just randomly opened it. And when I opened the prayer book, I noticed it was somewhere in the middle of a book of 500 plus pages. And I looked at the page and I read the words. And that was the first and the last page I read that day, because I found what I was looking for. And perhaps by listening to the words of what I read, you may find what you're looking for when it comes to some unspoken words that for some of you, you never got to say. It is a poem by Merritt Mallow, and it's in our Jewish prayer book and can be found in prayer books throughout the world. And here are the words that told me exactly what I need to do, and perhaps it'll speak with you. The name of the poem is When I Die. When I die, give what's left of me away to children and old men who wait to die. And if you need to cry, cry for your brother walking the street beside you. And when you need me, Put your arms around me. When you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. Look for me in the people I've known and the people who I have loved. And if you cannot give me away, at least let me live in your eyes and not your mind. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands, and by letting bodies touch bodies, and by letting go of children who need to be free. And always remember, love never dies. Only people do. So when all that's left of me is love, please give me away. When I read that poem, I knew what I needed to do to honor my father and to move forward in my life. Today, as Jews, it is the Day of Atonement. The day as Jews where the book of life for each one of us will be sealed along with our fate for the next year. Today, Yom Kippur, is the day that God will decide the fate for the next year for each one of us. The sun will be going down in a few hours. A few hours after that, the day will be gone. And each one of our books, the book of life for each one of us, will be sealed for the next year. But there's still a few hours left. There's still a chance to have one more conversation with God. And God is waiting. And if you decide to have just one more conversation before tomorrow begins, if you decide to talk to God one more time, acknowledge your deepest truth. Acknowledge whatever wounds you have from the past. And have an honest conversation with God from the deepest depths of your heart. And while you're at it, you may consider asking God if He wants you to be emotionally free from the past. Here's what God may say. God may say to you, I want more than anything for you to be free from the past and to live the rest of your life with joy and with peace in your heart. But I can't do it for you. I gave you the power to be emotionally free when you were old enough to have wisdom and to make wise decisions. But you never used the power I gave you. You have to do it yourself. Forgiving is a decision. And it is our God-given right to have peace of mind in this world. It is our God-given right to be emotionally free from the past. I also believe that God stands firmly in His decision that He will not do for us what He gave us the ability to do for ourselves. When it comes to self-love and living with a joyful heart, remind yourself that God gave each one of you a huge gift when He created you. God gave each one of you the ability to repair yourself emotionally. Use the tools you have. Don't let them waste away. You could start by making a decision. And the decision is that if you should, you must. Once you forgive, a transformation will take place, and you will become a teacher rather than a victim. You will teach others by example once you have forgiven how to live a life emotionally free from the past. You will be an example for everyone you meet and everyone you talk to. This will be a lasting contribution to the world. This will be part of your legacy. And you will make God very, very happy. I leave you with these words. It is not the past that defines who you are. It's what you do about it going forward. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much. And have a great rest of the afternoon.